Okay. Let's just jump right in today.
Sounds good.
So if you picture the map of Africa in early 1896, by this point, the Berlin Conference has happened, what, about a decade prior?
Yeah, 1884 to 85, so just about a decade, right?
Right. So the scramble for Africa is absolutely in full swing. And if you look at that map, it's basically this patchwork quilt of European colors. You've got British red, French blue, German, Portuguese. And the prevailing narrative in every single major capital, from London to Rome, is that this is inevitable.
Completely inevitable.
The continent is just being carved up, and any resistance is essentially considered, a speed bump, definitely not a brick wall.
Exactly. The assumption was just total domination. You have the Industrial Revolution in Europe creating this massive technological and military gap.
Mm-hmm.
And the narrative was that no African nation could possibly stand against a modern, industrialized European army in a conventional war. It was seen as almost a matter of physics, the strong conquer the weak.
And yet, on March 1st, 1896, in the really rugged mountains of northern Ethiopia, that narrative doesn't just get challenged. It gets completely dismantled.
Absolutely shattered.
We are talking about the Battle of Adwa. And to be clear, for everyone listening, this isn't just a story about a brave resistance that eventually loses. We see a lot of those in history.
Too many.
Yeah. But this is a decisive, crushing military victory by an African nation against a major European power.
It is really the massive anomaly of the 19th century. It's the event that forced the whole world to recalibrate its understanding of Africa. And today we're doing a deep dive into our source material, which is Adwa, the triumph of Ethiopian sovereignty. We really want to figure out how on earth this happened.
Because when you look at the odds, it just doesn't make sense on paper.
It doesn't.
So that's our mission for this deep dive. We want to move past that simple David versus Goliath headline and actually unpack the mechanics of this victory. How did Emperor Menelik II and Empress Taytu Betul pull this off?
Right, the geopolitics, the strategy.
Exactly. And honestly, I want to understand the specifics of the battle itself, too, because the sources suggest this was a masterclass in strategy. It wasn't just luck.
Oh, it was absolutely not luck. It was the result of years of diplomatic maneuvering, intense intelligence gathering, and a very specific kind of political unity that was incredibly hard to achieve.
Okay, so let's start with the catalyst. Usually when we talk about colonial wars, we're talking about a fight over resources or territory or a border dispute.
Sure.
But in this case, the spark for the whole thing seems to be a piece of paper. The Treaty of Wuchale.
The Treaty of Wuchale, yes. Signed in 1889 between Menelik II and Italy. Now, to understand why this blew up into a massive war, you really have to look at the text itself. Or, well, rather, the two texts.
The two versions.
Right. There was an Amharic version, the language of Ethiopia, and an Italian version. And the entire war essentially hinges on Article 17.
See, I love this detail because it feels like a legal thriller. What was the actual discrepancy? Was it just a bad translation? Or was it something more sinister?
It was almost certainly calculated deception by the Italians. In the Amharic version, which Menelik actually signed, Article 17 said that Ethiopia could use the services of the Italian government for its dealings with other European powers.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Could being the operative word there. It was an option, a convenience, basically.
Okay, so like, hey, if we need help talking to the British or the French, we'll give you a call.
Exactly. But the Italian version of that exact same article said Ethiopia must conduct all its foreign diplomacy through Italy.
Wow. Which effectively makes them a protectorate.
Precisely. Because in the language of international law at the time, if you cannot conduct your own foreign policy, you are not a sovereign nation, you are a subject.
Right.
So Italy took their version to the other European powers and said, look, Ethiopia is ours. We have the signature right here to prove it.
So Menelik is sitting there in Ethiopia, thinking he's signed a treaty of friendship and trade, and suddenly he finds out that over in Berlin and London, he's considered an Italian subject. How did he even find that out?
Well, he was an incredibly astute diplomat. He started writing letters to other heads of state, Queen Victoria, the Kaiser in Germany, and he's treating them as equals, proposing diplomatic relations.
And what did they say?
They wrote back, somewhat awkwardly, I imagine, saying, actually, we can't talk to you directly. We've been told we have to go through Rome.
Oh, man, that must have been a splash of cold water.
Definitely.
But this is where I really want to push on the how of it all. Because a lot of leaders in that era, faced with that reality, might have just accepted it. They'd realized they didn't have the military power to argue with the European empire and just swallow the fine print.
Yeah, submission was the norm.
Why did Menelik think he could just say no?
That's the key question. Menelik II wasn't just a provincial ruler. He was a modernizer with a very clear vision. He knew that rejecting the treaty meant war. There was no getting around that. So he had been preparing for this possibility for a long time. Yes. When he formally rejected the treaty in 1893, he didn't just rip up the paper and yell at them. He systematically undermined their leverage. He actually repaid the loan Italy had given him, with interest.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, just to show he wasn't a debtor. He cleared the books and effectively dared them to come and enforce their false claim. It was a massive assertion of sovereignty.
That takes some serious nerve. But as we know, nerve doesn't stop bullets.
No, it does not.
And this brings us to the preparation phase. Because I think a common misconception about Adwa is that this was a spears versus machine gun situation. But our source material makes it very clear that's not true.
That is probably the single biggest myth about the Battle of Adwa. The Ethiopian army was not primitive. In fact, by African standards of the time, it was incredibly modern.
How did they manage that?
Well, Menelik had spent the years leading up to 1896 essentially playing the European powers against each other.
Okay, explain that. Because usually these colonial powers had strict arms embargoes against African nations, right? They didn't want them armed.
They absolutely did. But the Europeans also fiercely hated each other. They were rivals. And Menelik leveraged this brilliant geopolitical game. He reached out to the French, who were major rivals with the British and the Italians in the region.
The enemy of my enemy.
Exactly. Then he reached out to the Russians, who actually saw Ethiopia as a fellow Orthodox Christian nation. There was a religious kinship there.
Oh, that's fascinating. I hadn't thought about the religious angle.
Yeah, it was very useful. So through these channels, he managed to import tens of thousands of modern rifles. We're talking about Remingtons, Vetterless, and crucially, artillery. He got his hands on Hotchkiss mountain guns.
So when the Italians eventually marched in, they weren't facing a disorganized mob with shields and spears. They were facing an army that, in some sectors, actually had better rifles than they did.
In terms of quantity, certainly. The Italians were actually using older models in some cases because they underestimated the threat, while Menelik's Imperial Guard was very well equipped. But having the equipment is really only half of the battle. The other half is the army itself, the people holding those rifles.
And this gets us to the unity part of the discussion, which honestly seems even more impressive than buying the guns. Ethiopia isn't a monolith. It's a massive, diverse region with different ethnic groups, different languages, and local kings who were historically often at war with each other.
Absolutely. You have the Tigray region in the north, the Amhara in the center, the Oromo in the south and west. Historically, the Italians were entirely banking on this division.
Divide and conquer.
Their entire strategy was divide and rule. They assumed that the local rivals, especially figures like Ras Mengesha in Tigray, would naturally side with the Italians to overthrow Menelik.
It's the classic colonial playbook. You back the rival, destabilize the central government, and sweep in as the savior. Why didn't it work this time?
Because Menelik and Empress Taytu were just politically brilliant. They framed the impending conflict not as a defense of the emperor's personal throne, but as an existential defense of their faith, their families, and their land against a foreign invader.
They made it bigger than politics.
Yes. There's this famous mobilization proclamation where Menelik basically says, enemies have come who would ruin our country and change our religion. Lend me your strength. If you are strong, lend me your strength. If you are weak, help me with your prayers.
Wow. And it worked. That call to arms actually worked across all those divided regions.
It worked beyond anyone's wildest expectations. You saw leaders like Ras Alula, who was a brilliant general from Tigray and a former bitter rival of Menelik, fully committing to the cause. You had Ras Mikhail leading the Oromo cavalry.
So it really was a coalition of rivals.
Exactly. The source mentions soldiers marching from the Gurage region, from Sidama. It was this unprecedented moment where the concept of Ethiopia superseded regional loyalty. They put internal differences totally aside for national defense.
Okay, so you have a united army, you have modern weapons, and you have this massive historic mobilization. The Italians, meanwhile, are under the command of General Baratieri. What is going on in their camp? Because they must realize pretty quickly this wasn't going to be a walk in the park.
Well, Baratieri was actually quite cautious at first. He knew the numbers were against him. He had about 17 or 18,000 troops in the area, while Menelik had mobilized upwards of 100,000.
100,000. That is a massive force to feed and supply.
Right. And Baratieri knew that. He wanted to wait them out. He figured the Ethiopian army was so huge that they would quickly exhaust the local food supplies and start starving if the standoff just dragged on.
That's a very valid military strategy. Starve the enemy out of their position. So why did they attack? Why force the issue?
Pure politics. Back in Rome, the prime minister, Francesco Crispi, was getting furious. He sent these scathing telegrams basically calling Baratieri a coward, saying this delay was a military phthisis, like a wasting disease.
Wow, essentially publicly shaming his own general.
Exactly. Crispi wanted a quick victory. He needed good headlines for domestic politics. So entirely against his better judgment and under this immense political pressure, Baratieri ordered an advance on the night of February 29th.
And this leads us to the morning of March 1st, 1896. The actual Battle of Adwa. The terrain here is really crucial to understand, isn't it? We're not talking about a flat, open field.
Not at all. This is the Adwa Mountains. It's incredibly steep, rocky, broken terrain with deep ravines and confusing passes. And this terrain is exactly where the Italian plan fell apart completely.
What was the plan supposed to be?
Baratieri's idea was to move his army forward in 3 separate columns during the night to occupy 3 specific peaks. It was supposed to be a coordinated advance, but they were working off of incredibly bad maps.
Wait, really? Bad maps?
Horrible maps. They were basically sketches. One brigade, led by General Albertone, marched way too far forward because the map completely mislabeled a hill. Another brigade got totally lost in the darkness and drifted left into the wrong valley.
So they separated themselves?
Yes. Instead of a unified, mutually supporting front, the Italian army split into 3 isolated chunks, completely unable to support each other or even communicate effectively.
And Menelik's forces were just waiting for them.
They were ready. And this is where we really have to highlight the tactical leadership on the Ethiopian side. Because again, to dispel a myth, this wasn't just a blind human wave attack. The Ethiopian commanders, Ras Alula, Ras Makonnen, Federari Gebehu, they saw these gaps opening up.
They read the battlefield.
Exactly. They used the terrain to surround and isolate each Italian column and destroy them one by one. In military terms, it's a classic tactic called defeat in detail. You take a smaller piece of the enemy and overwhelm it with your full force, then move to the next.
Let's focus on Empress Taytu Betul for a second, because the source explicitly calls her a brilliant political and military strategist. And I feel like so often in history, the quote-unquote queen role is reduced to moral support or diplomacy. But she was actually in the war room, wasn't she?
She wasn't just in the war room, she was heavily involved in battlefield decisions. Even before Adwa, during the siege of Mekelle, it was Taytu who spotted a crucial, fatal weakness in the Italian fortification.
What was it?
Their water supply. The Italians had fortified a position, but the well was outside their main defenses. She saw that and ordered her troops to seize the water source. It forced the Italians to surrender without the Ethiopians having to launch a massive, bloody frontal assault. That was entirely her call.
That is tactical genius. You don't fight the guns, you just starve them of water and wait for the white flag.
Exactly.
And what about at Adwa itself? Was she involved there?
At Adwa, she was literally commanding her own contingent of troops. When the Ethiopian center started to buckle at one point under heavy artillery fire, she was reportedly right there on the front lines, encouraging the soldiers, reinforcing the lines.
Really? In the middle of the fighting?
Yes. There are historical accounts of her and her retinue shouting at retreating soldiers, telling them to turn back and fight, shaming them into holding the line. She was an absolute iron lady of the battlefield.
It paints such a vivid picture. I mean, so you have the Italian columns separated, lost in the mountains. They are being completely swarmed by a numerically superior, highly motivated, and well-armed force. Their command structure just completely collapses.
It was utter chaos for them. By mid-afternoon on March 1st, the Italian army wasn't just retreating, it was disintegrating. They ended up losing nearly 70% of their force, killed, wounded, or captured.
70%, that's a total rout.
It wasn't just a loss, it was a national catastrophe for Italy.
And for Ethiopia, it was total vindication. But I want to pivot to the legacy now, the aftermath of this. The colonial steamroller just hits a wall and stops dead. The Italians eventually sign a new treaty, the Treaty of Adwa, which formally cancels the Treaty of Wuchale and recognizes Ethiopia's absolute independence.
And that is the pivotal moment. Because of that treaty, Ethiopia remains the only African nation to successfully defend its sovereignty and never be colonized during the scramble for Africa.
Which is an incredible distinction.
But the so what of this story, the real lasting legacy, goes way beyond the borders of Ethiopia.
Right. Our source material talks about the ripple effect. Now, news obviously didn't travel as fast back then as it does today, but this story essentially went viral, didn't it?
It went global. You really had to imagine the context of the world in 1896. Just for perspective, in the United States, Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court case that legally cemented racial segregation, happened in 1896.
Wow. The exact same year.
The exact same year. The world was actively solidifying white supremacy and the narrative of European racial dominance. And suddenly, right in the middle of that, here is a black emperor and empress forcing a major European power to its knees in battle.
It must have been absolutely electric for black people in the diaspora to hear that news.
It was a revelation. It provided concrete proof that colonialism could be resisted and defeated. It really helped birth and accelerate the concept of Ethiopianism, this religious and political movement that saw Ethiopia as a kind of Zion, a promised land of black freedom and independence. You see the influence in the Caribbean, you see it in Harlem, everywhere.
The outline of our source mentions specific future leaders who were influenced by this, like Marcus Garvey, Kwame Nkrumah, and later Nelson Mandela. How directly does Adwa connect to them?
Very directly. For Marcus Garvey, Ethiopia was the literal proof of concept for his Back to Africa movement. It showed that African civilization was valid, modern, and powerful. For leaders like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana and Mandela with the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, Ethiopia was a beacon. It became a rallying point for Pan-Africanism decades later.
It's amazing how a single day in 1896 echoes that far forward.
And you can literally see it. It's not a coincidence that when African nations finally started gaining independence in the 1950s and 60s, so many of them, Ghana, Senegal, Mali, and others, adopted the colors green, yellow, and red for their new national flags.
Wait, those are the Ethiopian flag colors?
Exactly. They adopted what we now call the Pan-African colors as a direct, intentional tribute to Ethiopia and the victory at Adwa. It was a way for these new nations to say, we are continuing the legacy of resistance and independence that started there.
That is fascinating. I always knew those were the Pan-African colors, but I never explicitly connected it to the fact that they were copying the one flag that the Europeans never managed to pull down.
It's a beautiful tribute. And look at the institutions today. The Organization of African Unity, which is now the African Union, where is its headquarters located?
It's in Addis Ababa.
Right, and that's not an accident. It's there because Ethiopia is viewed as the spiritual father of African independence. Adwa essentially made that city the diplomatic capital of Africa.
It really emphasizes that history isn't just dry stuff that happened in a vacuum. It's the actual architecture of the world we live in right now.
Absolutely. The victory preserved Ethiopian culture, its language, the Orthodox Church. But beyond that, it created a psychological shield for Black people globally. It broke the myth of invincibility. It proved that if you have the strategy, the unity, and the sheer will, the technology gap just doesn't matter as much as the colonial powers thought it did.
And that brings us to the present day. Adwa Victory Day is still a massive celebration, right?
Oh, it's huge. March 1st, it's a major national holiday in Ethiopia, of course, but it's also celebrated by the diaspora everywhere around the world. It's very much a living memory.
You know, we started this deep dive by talking about the map of Africa, that puzzle being forcefully pieced together by European empires. Adwa was the piece that simply refused to fit.
That's a great way to put it.
As we wrap up today, I want to leave you, the listener, with a thought that builds on the in essence section of our source material. The text centers heavily on the concept of determination, but I want to twist it a little bit for today's context. We spent a lot of time talking about how hard it was for Menelik to unite the Tigrayans, the Oromo, the Amhara. He had to build a fragile coalition of historical rivals to face a massive existential threat.
Right, and that internal unity was ultimately the deciding factor on the battlefield. Without it, the Italian divide and rule strategy would have worked perfectly.
Exactly. So when you look at the world today, a world that often feels incredibly fractured, whether we're talking about global geopolitics or even just intense internal polarization within our own countries, what is the modern lesson of Adwa?
I think the lesson is that sovereignty, in whatever form that takes, isn't something you are just given. It's maintained through cohesion.
Right. If Adwa proves that unity can overcome a massive technological and military disadvantage, What happens today when we have all the technology in the world, but we lose that unity? It seems like the biggest challenges to sovereignty and progress today aren't always external armies marching over a border. Sometimes the biggest threats are our own internal divisions.
That is the really profound question. Adwa shows the absolute power of the collective no to an outside force. But you can only say no to an outsider if you have successfully said yes to each other first.
You can only say no to an outsider if you've said yes to each other first. That is an incredibly powerful note to end on. We'll leave you all to chew on that one. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Battle of Adwa. We'll see you next time.